The morning the solicitor arrived at Ashpen Cottage, Marjorie Vane was on her knees in the kitchen garden, pulling frost-killed herbs from the soil. She heard the horse before she saw the man, and she did not straighten at once. She had learned, in 3 years of quiet solitude, that haste rarely improved a situation. The hoofbeats slowed on the gravel lane, paused, and she heard the click of a gate latch. Then footsteps. Then nothing. She set down the dead rosemary, stripped the soil from her gloves, and stood. The man was perhaps 50, in a dark coat and a wig gone slightly gray at the temples. He held a leather case against his chest as though it were an infant. His face, when he saw her, went through several stages of rearrangement before settling on something approximating professional composure. "I'm looking," he said carefully, "for a Mrs. Bramwell. The late Mrs. Bramwell." Marjorie dusted her hands against each other. The air smelled of cold earth and approaching rain. Across the valley, the hills were the color of pewter, and the village of Darnwick lay tucked below them, like something set aside and forgotten. The lane behind the solicitor was empty. He had come alone. "You have found her," she said. He stared at her for a long moment, then looked down at his case. When he raised his eyes again, there was something behind them that was not quite apology and not quite alarm, but lay unhappily between the two. "I am Mr. Fortescue, of Fortescue and Allard," he said, "solicitors of record for the estate of Mr. Aldous Bramwell. I have been charged with the conveyance of this property." He paused. "Madam, it is our understanding that you perished in the crossing from Calais in October of 1814. The crossing from Calais. The storm that had overturned the packet boat. The 19 bodies recovered from the water, and the 14 that had not been." Marjorie said nothing. "The estate was settled accordingly, Mr." Fortescue continued, his voice growing smaller with every sentence. "The cottage was passed, under the terms of the original purchase deed, to the Bramwell heir. That heir has now directed the sale of the property to a third party. The new purchaser, Viscount Halford, will take possession on the 22nd of November." He stopped. He had the look of a man who had delivered unwelcome news many times, but had never delivered it to the recipient of her own death. The 22nd of November was 9 days away. If you have ever wondered what it costs a woman to stand very still in a kitchen garden and hold her expression level while the world falls out from beneath her feet, stay with this story. Marjorie Vane had paid that price before. She was about to pay it again. She had been 22 when she married Aldous Bramwell. 22, the daughter of a country physician who had left her a modest income and a smaller estate of good character. And Aldous had been handsome and certain and several years older, which in that season had seemed recommendation enough. The house he had kept in Bath was well appointed. His friends had the correct names. His mother had received her with the particular warmth that masks reservation, and Marjorie, who was perceptive only at the edges of her own happiness, had not understood what she was being received into. Understanding came slowly, the way cold comes slowly through the walls of an old house. The first winter, she noticed how Aldous looked at her across a dinner table when she had said something he found ill-timed. The second, she noticed how he described her to his acquaintance, and the description did not match the person she believed herself to be. By the third, she had learned to read the quality of his silence, and the quality of his silences had become the primary language of their household. She was not mistreated in any manner that left a mark the law could see. She was merely managed. Her income, which had been settled to her use on the marriage, was administered by Aldous through the mechanism of her cheerful cooperation, and her cheerful cooperation was secured by the mechanism of his displeasure, and his displeasure was secured by the mechanism of her fear of it. It was all very legal and very orderly, and left nothing to point at. She had had one friend in Bath, a woman named Mrs. Dorinda Fry, whose husband kept rooms on the same street. and Dorinda had said to her once, in the manner of someone speaking carefully around a sharp thing, that she seemed a woman who had learned to walk very quietly in her own house. Marjorie had said nothing then. She had thought of it many times since. Ashpen Cottage had been her father's, left to her by entail, and it was the one property Aldous had never been able to reach. He had tried, in the early years, to persuade her to sell it. Later, he had tried other means. The cottage sat in the valley below the Darnwick Hills, 4 rooms and a good kitchen garden, and the smell of hay from the farm behind it, and it was the one place in Marjorie's existence that had never asked her to be other than she was. When she left Aldous, she did not go to the cottage first. She went to the coast. She had intended Calais. She had a plan of modest coherence, a small amount of money she had set aside over 18 months, and a letter from a distant cousin in Normandy who had extended a welcome she was not sure she had earned. The storm had not been part of the plan. She had been on the packet boat, and the storm had been sudden and very bad, and the water had come over the side in a way she had not expected, and she had not drowned, precisely. But she had come close enough that when she woke on a fisherman's beach at Gravelines with half the salt of the channel in her lungs, it had taken her a full 2 days to understand that she was still alive. And then she had understood something else, that no one knew she was alive, that the passenger list had her name on it, that 19 people had not come out of the water, and that the world, left to its own reasonable conclusion, had decided she was one of them. She thought of Aldous. She thought of what it would mean to send word. She thought, for 3 days, with the cousin's family feeding her soup and asking nothing. And at the end of 3 days she wrote not to Aldous, but to her father's former solicitor, Mr. Greaves of Darnwick, and asked him, in careful language, whether Ashpen Cottage had passed to any other party. It had not. It was hers still. The entail ran to the female line. She came home in the spring of 1815 on a fishing boat out of Boulogne, and she came quietly, and she came alone, and she told no one who she was. She was a widow, she said, from Shropshire, come to let the cottage for the season, and perhaps longer. Mr. Greaves, who had known her father and had held her christening robe while her father searched for a pin, looked at her for a long moment across his desk and then said nothing that was not professionally necessary. And she had lived in Ashpen Cottage for 3 years as a dead woman living. It had been, on balance, the least unhappy 3 years of her adult life. Now, Mr. Fortescue stood in her kitchen garden and told her that Aldous was dead, and that he had sold the cottage to a Viscount Halford, and that she had 9 days to disappear again, or explain herself to a world that had filed her neatly in the past. She asked Mr. Fortescue to come inside. She gave him tea and sat across from him at the kitchen table and asked him to explain in precise detail the sequence of the estate settlement. He was a thorough man, and he explained it thoroughly. Aldous had died in August of 1817, a fever of the chest, in Bath. The estate had gone to his brother's son, a young man named Clement, who had known neither Aldous well nor the particulars of the Bramwell marriage. Clement had settled the bathhouse and the various investments, and come at last, 3 months later, to the small matter of the cottage in Darnwick that his uncle had purchased some years before the marriage, and that had, in the terms of the settlement, gone to the widow. The widow being dead, it reverted to the estate. Clement, who was not a sentimental man and had no attachment to Darnwick, had accepted an offer from Lord Halford's agent. "And Lord Halford?" Marjorie said. "What does he want with it?" "His lordship is re-establishing the family estate at Darnwick Hall," Mr. Fortescue said. He set down his cup with the care of a man handling facts he was not entirely comfortable with. "The cottage sits on the boundary of the original Hall parkland. The previous Viscount sold it separately, some 40 years past. Lord Halford has been purchasing the original parcels back. Marjorie looked at her kitchen. The copper pots on their hooks, the dried lavender in a bundle by the window, gone pale with the season, her father's blue and white plates on the dresser, the ones she had wrapped in linen and carried from Somerset when she was 8 years old and remembered every nick. "I see," she said. "Mr." Fortescue set down his case, removed from it a document, and laid it on the table between them with the expression of a man depositing something that might go off. It was a notice of possession. Her name was not on it. The name on it was that of a woman who had drowned in the Channel 3 years before. "Madame," he said, and stopped. He tried again. "Madame, I do not know how to proceed. I was not aware that you lived. My client was not aware. Lord Halford's agent was not aware. The law is, in this circumstance, not entirely clear to me." Marjorie folded her hands in her lap. "It is clear to me," she said. "The cottage was settled to me on my marriage. The entail runs in the female line. I did not die. It is mine. You would need to establish that you are who you say you are, Mr." Fortescue said carefully, "before any court, or any party who disputed it." She had spent 3 years as a dead woman, building a life on silence, and she had been at peace with that silence because the alternative had been to return to Aldous. Aldous was gone now. The silence was, perhaps, its own kind of trap. "Very well," she said. "Then I will establish it." She had said it as one says a thing that is necessary and unpleasant, like taking a bitter draught for an illness that has gone on too long. She had not yet considered the particular quality of the man she would need to establish it to. She had not yet understood that Lord Halford had come to Darnwick Hall himself, or that he had come in the last week, or that she had seen his carriage pass the cottage lane twice without knowing whose it was. She understood these things the following morning, when he appeared at her gate. She was again in the garden. She had not slept well. The notice of possession lay on the kitchen table where she had left it, and she had woken twice in the night and gone to look at it as if it might have changed, and each time it had said the same things, in the same careful legal hand. She heard the gate. She turned. He was tall, and he stood very still in the way of men who do not need to move to command a space. He was perhaps 35, broad-shouldered in a dark coat that had seen recent road travel, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read, because it was not the expression she had expected. She had expected authority, or impatience, or the mild affronted surprise of a man whose property has been occupied without his knowledge. He looked instead, as though he was doing some swift interior calculation, and had not yet arrived at the sum. "Miss Vane," he said. He had a low, level voice, the kind that carried without being raised. "I am Mrs. Bramwell," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Or I was. He is dead now, so I am not entirely sure what I am." He was quiet for a moment. "Vane," he said. "You are George Vane's daughter, the physician?" She had not expected that. "You knew my father," she said. "He delivered my younger brother." He paused. 31 years ago. He came in the middle of the night in January and stayed 3 hours and did not send a bill. My father spoke of him until he died." He was still at the gate. She had not invited him in, and he had not moved to enter. He held his hat in his hands, which she noticed only because it was an unusual posture for a man of his position in a situation of this kind. Most men of his position would have been inside and at the table by now. "Mr. Fortescue came to see me yesterday," she said. "I know. He came to see me afterward." He looked at her steadily. "He told me that you are alive. He told me that the situation is, in his view, legally uncertain." A pause. "Mrs. Bramwell, I am not a man who wishes to put a living woman out of her home." She had been braced for something else. Some version of Aldous. Some management by pleasantness that would arrive eventually at the same result. "The sale has been concluded," she said. "It has," he said. "Which is why I am here, rather than sending my agent." He looked past her, briefly, at the cottage. The wisteria was gone bare with the cold, and the shutters on the east window needed rehanging, a task she had been putting off since September. She watched him look at the shutters, and she did not know what he saw there, only that he did not seem to see dilapidation. "May I come in?" he said, "and discuss this properly?" She should have said yes immediately. She said it after a pause of perhaps 4 seconds, which was long enough that he noticed, and she saw the noticing in the slight adjustment of his posture, the way he did not react to it, but simply held the information. She was not practiced, she realized, at admitting anyone. 3 years of solitude had made her careful in ways she had not fully understood until this moment. Inside, she made tea again, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table, and she noticed that he looked at her father's plates on the dresser. He did not say anything about them. He simply looked. "The entail," she said. She needed them to be on practical ground. "I have Mr. Fortescue's view," he said, "which is that the entail is yours, and that the sale cannot stand if you are living and can establish your identity. He believes a magistrate would concur. The difficulty is Clement, the Bramwell nephew, who has already spent the purchase price on improvements to his own property, and who will not welcome the news." She had not thought of him as a person who might be inconvenienced. She had been so focused on her own situation that she had failed to trace the injury outward. "I have also," Lord Halford said, "been to see Mr. Greaves." Marjorie set down her cup. "He told me," Lord Halford said carefully, "that he had maintained your father's papers in the event that any question of identity might arise. He was quite insistent that he had never believed the story of your death." Old Mr. Greaves, who had held her christening robe and said nothing. 3 years of saying nothing. And all along the papers held safe in his desk. "He is a good man," she said, and her voice came out shorter than she intended, because the gratitude was larger than she had room for at the moment. "He is," Lord Halford said. "He has the documents. Your father's birth record, your baptismal entry, the original deed of settlement, and 3 letters in Aldous' own hand referencing the entail. They make your case quite legible." She looked at him. He looked back. The fire was small, and the kitchen was not cold, and she was aware, abruptly, of the quality of the air in the room, the particular weight of his attention, and the fact that she did not know this man at all, and he had, in 24 hours, taken more care of her interests than anyone had since her father's death. "Why," she said, "you purchased this property in good faith. The law is uncertain, as Mr. Fortescue said. You could contest it." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that he was choosing his words not from calculation, but from the effort of saying an honest thing in a register that had not often been required of him. "My wife died," he said, 4 years ago. She was ill for 2 years before that." He looked at the table, then back at her. "I spent those 2 years being practical. Managing the estate, managing the physicians, managing the necessary conversations with necessary people. I was very efficient about it." He paused. "I do not care for the man that efficiency made of me." She did not speak. "Your father's name is in my family's memory as a man who came in the middle of the night and asked for nothing. I would rather try to deserve that than contest an entail against a woman who lived in a cottage for 3 years because she had nowhere else to be." She had not told him why she had come back to the cottage. She had told him nothing except that Aldous was dead and that she was not sure what she was. He had arrived at the rest by himself, or by inference, or by some quality of perception she had not anticipated. She looked at her hands. He had come a very long way in his quiet, for a man who owed her nothing. "What happens to you?" she said. "If the sale is overturned, you lose the purchase price." "Clement Bramwell owes me the purchase price," he said. "He will not enjoy repaying it. I intend to give him the opportunity to be gracious about it." There was something in the way he said it, the slight dryness in an otherwise level voice, that told her he did not seriously expect Clement to be gracious, and that he had already considered what the other outcome looked like, and had decided to pursue this one regardless. She felt, for the first time in 3 years, the specific dizzying sensation of being seen. She was not ready to be seen. She was not sure she remembered how. She had built her invisibility so carefully, for such good reason, that it had become structural, and she did not know what stood if it came down. November passed in documents. Mr. Fortescue wrote to Mr. Greaves. Mr. Greaves wrote to the county magistrate. Lord Halford's own solicitor arrived from London, a brisk young man named Mr. Cawley, who could not conceal his fascination with the case, and conferred with Mr. Fortescue over the kitchen table for the better part of an afternoon, while Marjorie sat in the garden and tried to feel the ground beneath her feet. Mr. Cawley's questions were precise, and his manner was thoughtful, and she was grateful for both, and for the way he addressed her, as though her continued existence were entirely unremarkable. Lord Halford came 4 times in those 9 days. Each time he came on some stated practical pretext, a document to show her, a question Mr. Fortescue had asked that required her answer, a letter from the Bramwell solicitor that he wished her to see before responding. Each time the stated pretext occupied perhaps a quarter of the visit. The rest was tea, and the kitchen table, and the kind of conversation that does not announce itself as significant, but accumulates in small, specific layers that she found herself thinking about later in the silence of the evening. She told him about her father's practice, the late-night calls, the patients who could not pay, the way he had kept a second ledger that listed what was owed and a third that listed what had been forgiven. He listened without looking away. He told her about Darnwick Hall as it had been when he was a child, the West Gallery with its painted ceiling, the walled garden his mother had kept, the state it had fallen into after his father's poor decisions, and his own long absence in the years after his wife died. He had come back to restore it, he said. Not from sentiment, but because he had run out of reasons not to. She did not tell him about Aldous. She did not need to. He did not ask. On the 7th day, he came without a pretext. She heard his horse at the lane and went to the door, and he was already at the gate. And he looked at her with the expression she had been watching accumulate across 9 days of kitchen table conversation. And he did not pretend, this time, to have a document. "I wish to know how you were," he said. It was such a simple sentence. She had forgotten that sentences could be that simple. "I am frightened," she said, which was also a simple sentence, and one she had not planned to say. He opened the gate and came up the path and stopped at a proper distance. He did not reach for her hand. He did not manage the distance or reduce it without her permission. He simply stood in the November air and looked at her with the steady gravity of a man who knew what fear felt like and did not think it required correction. "Of the hearing," she said, meaning the magistrate's appointment in 4 days. "Yes," he said. "And?" She looked at the bare wisteria, at the east shutter still hanging crooked on its hinge, at the valley below, the village of Darnwick sitting where it had always sat. "Of what happens after," she said. He was quiet. A long, respectful quiet that was not silence, but thinking. "I have no answer for that," he said at last. except that what happens after does not have to be decided before the hearing. She had been deciding all of it at once, alone, in the manner of a woman who had learned to decide everything alone, because there was no one else. She had been calculating the hearing and the legal outcome, and the question of the Bramwell estate, and the question of what the village would make of her return from the dead, and the question of what she would be, legally and socially, when it was all settled. And she had been doing all of this while also making tea and tending the garden and lying awake at 2 a.m, looking at the possession notice on the kitchen table. She had been carrying it the way she had once carried every difficulty, which was to say in both hands and without complaint and in complete privacy. He had seen this, somehow without her telling him. "Come inside," she said. "I will make tea." He came inside. He sat at the kitchen table, and she made tea, and neither of them pretended it was about the documents. "My wife's name was Charlotte," he said after a while. He said it simply, without the quality of announcement that men sometimes brought to their grief, as though they needed credit for having had it. She was funny before she was ill. She laughed at things I did not expect. I missed that first when she was ill, before I missed anything else. Marjorie turned from the hearth with the kettle. "What did you do?" she said. "In the years after?" "I worked," he said. "I corresponded. I managed the estate from a distance and visited occasionally and found the hall in a worse state each time and told myself I would attend to it next season." He paused. A man can be very busy and still be nowhere. She set the kettle down. She looked at him. There was a quality of honesty in him that she had not expected and was still not accustomed to, a readiness to say the plain thing about his own failures that she associated with men who had arrived somewhere past vanity, not through indifference, but through cost. She had known since the second visit that she was in some danger from this man. Not the danger she had known with Aldous, which was a danger of reduction, of being made less by steady degrees. This was another kind. The kind that came from being in the presence of someone whose quality of attention made you aware of your own, and made you aware that you had been keeping it locked up for a very long time. She had not intended to fall in love in the middle of a legal dispute over her own legal existence. It seemed a disproportionate complication. He looked at her father's plates on the dresser again. "Your father bought those in Bath," he said. "There was a shop near the pump room." She stared at him. "He described them," Lord Halford said, "in a letter to my father. He had gone to Bath for a medical conference and had seen a set of blue and white plates in a shop window, and deliberated for 2 days, and then bought them, and felt foolish about it for a week afterward. He felt foolish about them until the day he died," she said, and the grief and the laughter arrived at the same moment, which was the first time either had arrived together in 3 years. The hearing was 4 days later, at the magistrate's office in the village. She wore her best morning dress, which was gray wool and 3 seasons old, and she put on her good gloves, and she walked to the village alone in the early morning because the cottage was half a mile, and she wanted the air. The lane was empty, and the elms were bare, and the sky above Darnwick was the pale flat gray of a November morning. And she walked steadily, and did not let herself think past the next step. The magistrate, Sir Edmund Farrow, was a spare man of 60 with a careful manner, and the room contained, besides himself and Marjorie, Mr. Fortescue, Mr. Greaves, Lord Halford's London solicitor, Mr. Cawley, and a young man she recognized after a moment as Clement Bramwell, who sat in the corner with the look of someone who had been told to be gracious and was finding it difficult. Clement was 23, with his uncle's good looks and a rather less certain jaw. He had brought his own solicitor, a person of middle age who shuffled papers and said very little. Mr. Greaves set the documents on the desk. The baptismal entry, the deed of settlement, the 3 letters in Aldous' hand. Sir Edmund read them with the attention of a man who had seen every kind of human difficulty the county could produce, and had learned not to be surprised. And when he had read them all, he set them down and looked at Marjorie. "Mrs. Bramwell," he said, "are you able to identify these documents as pertaining to yourself?" "I am," she said. "And you can confirm that you are the person named in the deed of settlement, and that you did not die in the crossing from Calais in October of 1814. "I can confirm both," she said. "And you are willing to affix your signature to a declaration to that effect, to be filed with this office?" "I am," she said. He nodded. He looked briefly at the young man, and Clement's jaw tightened, and Clement's solicitor shuffled his papers one final time, and then stopped. There was a silence of perhaps 5 seconds. It was not a dramatic silence. Sir Edmund did not declaim. He simply turned to his desk and drew forward a document and dated it, and the room exhaled in the way of rooms where something has shifted and everyone present knows it. She signed her name, Marjorie Ann Vane Bramwell, and the pen scratched across the paper in the way of things made legal, and it was done. She had existed, officially and documentably, for all the years she had been absent from the record. The record simply had not known it. Afterward, in the lane outside the magistrate's office, Clement approached her. He looked up close, younger than his uncle had ever looked, and more uncomfortable. "I understand," he said carefully, "that Lord Halford has been in correspondence with my solicitor regarding the purchase sum." "I believe so," she said. "I would like to say," he said, and stopped and tried again. "My uncle was not a kind man. It was not much. It was also more than Aldous had ever managed in 6 years of marriage." "I know," she said. She did not make him say anything else. Lord Halford was waiting by the wall of the churchyard across the lane. He had not come into the hearing room. She had not asked him to, and he had not offered. And she had understood the consideration of that. He stood now with his hat in his hands again, the same posture she had first seen at her gate, and he watched her cross the lane with an expression she could now read. She had learned his face in 9 days. The way you learn the light in a room you have come to know well. "Well," he said. "It is settled," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Marjorie." And it was the first time, and the sound of her name in his voice was so different from the way Aldous had said it, which was always slightly wrong, always with some proprietary edge, that she stood very still in the lane and felt the difference all the way through. "I would like," he said, with the care of a man saying a true thing in a situation where he was not entirely sure it was welcome, "to call on you properly, with your permission." She thought of the kitchen table and her father's plates, and a man who had come without a pretext on the 7th day, and asked how she was. "You have been calling on me for 9 days," she said. "Improperly," he said, under the cover of legal necessity. There was that dryness again, the slight warmth in an otherwise level voice. She had come to look for it the way she looked for a particular quality of light in the late afternoon. "Yes," she said. "You may call." He was not a man who showed a great deal on his face. She had learned that too. The particular quality of what moved through his expression then was slight, but she had been watching, and she did not miss it. The walk back to the cottage was half a mile, and she walked it slowly, through the November morning, past the elms that had lost their leaves, and the gray stone walls with their lichen, past the farm gate and the smell of hay. And when she came to her own gate, she stopped and held the iron for a moment and looked at the cottage. The east shutter was still crooked on its hinge. She went inside, and she hung up her coat, and she went to the kitchen table, and she picked up the possession notice, and she folded it once, and carried it to the fire, and set it on the coals, and watched it go. Then she took her father's plates down from the dresser, one by one, and washed them. Not because they needed washing, but because she wanted to hold them. And she set them back in their places on the dresser shelf and looked at them in the morning light. She did not know entirely what she was now. A living woman who had been legally dead. A wife who had been widowed without knowing she was a widow. A person who had lived 3 years in a silence that was equal parts peace and hiding. And who had emerged from it not because she had chosen to, but because a solicitor had come to her gate with a notice of possession in a leather case. She was also, she thought, a woman who had not flinched at the signing table, and had not wept in the lane, and had not been reduced by any of the machinery that had tried to reduce her. She knew that Lord Halford would call on her properly, in the ordinary manner, and that the calls would be what the visits had already been, only without the pretext, and that the pretext had been a thin thing anyway that neither of them had entirely believed. She knew that the village of Darnwick would have opinions about the woman who had come back from the dead, and the Viscount who was restoring the hall on the hill, and that the opinions would be various and not all of them kind, and that she had survived more organized opposition than village opinion, and would survive this too. She knew that Mr. Greaves had kept the documents in his desk for 3 years, saying nothing, waiting for the question to be asked. She would bring him a jar of the kitchen garden jam in the spring, which was not adequate payment for 3 years of faithful silence, but which was the kind of payment he would understand. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the garden. The rosemary was dead, and the lavender was past its season, and the ground was cold and gray-brown, and in 3 months it would look entirely different, because it always did. The following week he came on a Tuesday in the afternoon, without pretexts of any kind. He brought with him a small package of papers he said were from Mr. Greaves, and they set the papers aside without looking at them, and drank tea and talked until the light had gone from the room, and she had to light the candles. And when the candles were lit, the kitchen was warm and close, and smelled of the dried lavender by the window. He told her that the west gallery at the hall had been replastered, and that the painters were coming in the spring. She told him about a passage in one of her father's medical notebooks that she had found in the cottage last summer, a careful description of the delivery of a child in January, at a house on the estate road, in the middle of the night. She had read it twice when she found it, not knowing then whose house it was. "That would be my brother," he said. And the warmth in his voice then was the specific warmth of a man who does not often speak of such things, and means this one. She set down her cup. He was looking at her. She was looking at him. "I have been thinking," she said, "of what happens after." He was very still. "I have not resolved it," she said. "I only wanted you to know that I am thinking of it." He said quietly, "I'm glad." She reached across the table and set her hand over his, briefly, and the warmth of it went through the cotton of her glove, and she took her hand back. He did not move. The candles held steady in the still kitchen air, and the fire was small, and the November night was pressed against the windows, and inside the cottage was warm, and her father's plates stood on the dresser in their usual arrangement, the one with the chip on the rim in the 3rd position from the left where it had always been. She had come back to the cottage 3 years ago because she had nowhere else to be. She was beginning to understand that it had been, all along, the right place. If this story moved you, let it settle a moment. Sometimes the right place is the one we almost lost. Spring came to the valley the way spring always came, gradually and then all at once, and the kitchen garden filled in from the edges, and the wisteria put out new growth along the cottage wall, pale and persistent against the old stone, and on an April morning that smelled of warm earth and something green and hopeful, she stood at the gate and watched the lane and heard his horse on the gravel, and she did not wait inside. She opened the gate before he reached it. He dismounted and handed the reins to the groom who rode behind him and came toward her with his hat in his hands and the morning light on his face. And she had, by now, stopped counting his visits, and she did not need to count them. "Marjorie," he said. "I have made the tea already," she said. "You are late." Something moved in his face that was not quite amusement, and not quite tenderness, but held elements of both, and she had come to recognize it as the expression closest to the truth of him. He came through the gate. He offered her his arm, and she took it, and they went together into the cottage, and the door swung to on the spring morning, and the kettle was on, and her father's plates were on the dresser, where they had always been. The chipped one stood in the third position from the left. It was where she had always put it,